There is a type of sadness that does not ask permission to enter, that is not accompanied by explanations or justifications, that simply settles in you like a dense fog that appears out of nowhere and turns everything into weight, into gray, into emptiness. And when you try to explain it to someone, when you try to put into words this feeling that takes over every cell of your body without anything wrong having happened in your life, you realize that there is no adequate language for it. There is no narrative that makes sense, because how do you explain that you are sad for no reason when we live in a society that demands that every emotion has an identifiable cause? When everyone expects you to point to an event, a person, a circumstance that justifies what you feel. And Simone Weil, a French philosopher who lived only 34 years but who delved deeper into the abyss of the human soul than most manage in a lifetime. She knew this sadness. She felt it in her own skin, in her own guts, and what she discovered about this nameless pain goes against everything modern culture teaches us about dealing with emotions. Difficult, about the need to always be well, always productive, always justifying our existence through achievements and smiles. Have you ever woken up one day and simply couldn't find a reason to get out of bed? Not because something terrible happened, but because life itself seemed to have lost color, flavor, meaning. Have you ever felt your body heavy as if gravity had tripled during the night? Your mind enveloped in a fog that turns simple thoughts into insurmountable mountains? And the worst, the absolute worst, is that when people ask what's wrong, you have no answer because there is nothing objectively wrong. Your life may be going well in the measurable aspects, reasonable work, existing relationships, acceptable physical health. But something inside you is off, disconnected, absent. And then comes the guilt, the terrible guilt of being sad for no apparent reason when there are people with real problems, when you should be grateful for what you have, when your sadness seems like an unjustifiable luxury in the face of the visible suffering of others. Simone Weil not only understood this sadness, she named it, she gave it to her. Explored, she lived it with an intensity that almost consumed her. And if you feel that these words are touching something deep inside you, something you didn't even know was waiting to be said, then subscribe to this channel now, because we are going to explore together truths that most avoid looking at, paths that Simone Weil has walked with her entire life, and you won't want to miss what comes next, because what she discovered about this sadness for no reason, about this emptiness that doesn't ask for permission, will completely change the way you seize your own pain, and it may be exactly what stands between you and the total isolation that threatens to swallow you right now. Because Weil knew something that our culture has forgotten. She knew that this sadness, without an apparent cause, is not weakness. It is not a character flaw. It is not ingratitude for life. It is something much deeper and much more important than any superficial diagnosis could capture. It is a call from the soul that is trying to tell you something urgent, something you can no longer ignore, something that can only be heard in the heavy silence of this sadness inexplicable. And before you completely isolate yourself from the world, before you close all the doors and windows of your emotional life, before you decide that it is safer not to feel anything than to feel this, you need to understand what Simone Weil discovered about the nature of this pain, because it may be exactly the door you were looking for without knowing it, the passage to something you had no idea existed on the other side of all this weight, this fog, this void that seems to have no bottom or end. You are sad for no reason, and it terrifies you because we live in a culture that has turned emotions into problems to be solved, symptoms to be medicated, flaws to be corrected. And when your sadness has no identifiable cause, when there is no traumatic event to point to, no broken relationship to blame, no concrete loss to process, you feel lost in a maze with no map, no compass, no even certainty that there is a way out. And the first thing everyone around you will do, with the best intentions, is try to convince you that there must be a reason. There must be something that you are not seeing, not admitting, not processing properly. Well-meaning friends will suggest that maybe you are suppressing some emotion, that maybe there is a hidden trauma waiting to be discovered, Therapists will look for causes in your childhood, in your family history, in your relationship patterns, and yes, sometimes they find something. Sometimes there really is an hidden reason hoping to be revealed, but Simone Weil knew that sometimes, just sometimes, sadness has no reason because it doesn't need to have a reason, because it is not a symptom of a specific problem waiting to be solved. It is something much more fundamental, much more essential to the human condition. And this possibility, this radical idea that your sadness can have no identifiable cause and yet be completely valid, completely real, completely worthy of attention. This idea is almost impossible to accept for the modern mind that has been trained to believe that everything has an explanation, everything has a solution. Everything can be optimized and corrected if we just find the right tool, the right technique, the competent professional. You've probably tried it all. Mindfulness, physical exercise, balanced diet, vitamin supplements, cognitive therapy, antidepressant medication, forced gratitude, positive affirmations. And maybe some of these things have helped a little. Maybe they've taken the sharpest edge of the pain away. But deep down where you rarely have the courage to look, the sadness continues, persistent, inexplicable, irreducible to any simple narrative of cause and effect. And the scariest thing is that the more you try to understand where it comes from, the more it seems to deepen, the more you fight against it, the more it spreads. As if the very attempt to eliminate it was what keeps it alive, growing, taking up more and more space in your inner life. Simone Weil experienced this in her own body, in her own soul. She who had a brilliant mind, a privileged education, a loving family, yet carried within herself a sadness that could not be explained by the external circumstances of her life since she was a teenager. She struggled with intense headaches that no doctor could cure. But more than physical pain, there was something in her soul that always felt out of place, inadequate, heavy. She wrote about feeling fundamentally different from others, not in any special or superior way, but in ways that made her question whether she really belonged in the human world, whether there was something essentially wrong with the way she existed, and that feeling of not belonging, of always being slightly out of sync with the rest of humanity, is something you know, don't you? You know the feeling. You know the experience of being in a room full of people laughing and feeling like there's an invisible glass separating you from all that joy. You know the experience of participating in moments that are supposed to be happy, parties, meetings, celebrations, and feeling just emptiness, just tiredness. Just the unbearable weight of having to pretend you're there when in fact you're miles away emotionally. And then comes the urge, the terrible and understandable urge to isolate yourself, to stop pretending, to simply withdraw from the world and let the sadness consume you in peace. Without having to explain, without having to justify, without having to carry the added weight of disappointing people who want you to get better, who expect you to try harder, who believe that if you just tried harder, thought more positively, chose happiness, everything would be fine. But Simone Weil didn't choose isolation as the final answer to her sadness, at least not in the way you might be thinking. She did something much more radical, much more courageous, much scarier. She decided to look directly at that sadness for no reason, diving into it completely, going through it to the other side, not trying to explain it, not trying to cure it, not trying to change it into something else, simply letting it be exactly what it was. And what she found at the center of that inexplicable sadness was not what she expected. It was not what anyone expects. It was something that our culture has taught us to avoid at all costs, but which may be exactly what you are unknowingly looking for. And before we explore what she found, you need to understand why this sadness for no reason scares you so much. Why the impulse to isolate yourself is so strong. Why it seems safer to disappear from the world than to continue carrying this inexplicable weight while trying to maintain the appearance of normality. The truth that no one wants to admit is that your unreasonable sadness may be trying to show you something about the nature of human existence that you have spent your entire life avoiding. Something that our entire society is built to keep you from seeing. Because if you really looked at it, If you really understood it, you could no longer live the same way. No longer could you accept the comfortable lies we all tell to make life bearable. Simone Weil had a word to describe the fundamental human condition. She called it malheur, which is usually translated as affliction, or affliction in Portuguese, but this translation does not fully capture what it says. I would say, because affliction for Weil was not just suffering, it was not just psychological or physical pain. It was something much more devastating, much more total. It was the experience of being simultaneously destroyed in 3 dimensions: physical, psychological, and social, of feeling that your own humanity is being eroded, that you are becoming less than human, that there is an abyss between you and the rest of existence that no bridge can cross. And this affliction does not need a specific external cause to exist. It can arise simply from the pure awareness of being alive in a universe that you are fundamentally indifferent to your existence, of carrying around a body that will die, a mind that could break, a heart that could be crushed, and no guarantee, no absolute guarantee that anything you do, feel, or are actually matters in the grand scheme of things. That is the brutal truth that your reasonless sadness may be trying to show you. It's not that something is wrong with you. It's that you are beginning to see something about the reality that most people spend their entire lives hiding from themselves. You are beginning to feel the real weight of human existence without the comforting filters that society offers us. The work that keeps us too busy to think. The relationships that make us feel less alone. The achievements that convince us that our lives have purpose. The entertainments that fill every second of potential silence. All of these things are valid. They all have their place, but they also act as anesthesia against the raw realization that we are here, conscious, mortal, fundamentally alone in our subjective experience, carrying questions for which there are no satisfactory answers, facing a future that is simultaneously inevitable and completely uncertain. Weil wrote that most of what we call human culture is simply elaborate methods of avoiding looking directly at our real condition, complex systems of distraction that allow us to live as if death did not exist, as if suffering were not inevitable, as if we were not all heading towards the same nothingness from which we came. And when your reasonless sadness appears, when it settles in you without invitation and without explanation, what is really happening is that these defense systems are temporarily failing. The distractions are not working. The denial mechanisms are breaking down. And you're being forced to feel the real weight of being alive without any cushioning. And it's absolutely terrifying. It's so terrifying that your first instinct is to isolate yourself, to disappear, to stop trying to keep up appearances, because at least in solitude you don't have to pretend everything's fine. You don't have to carry the added weight of managing other people's expectations of how you should be feeling. But Simone Weil knew that isolation alone doesn't solve anything, because you can't isolate yourself from yourself. You can't run away from yourself. Your own conscience. And the sadness you carry goes with you wherever you try to hide. So what do you do when you realize that you can't run away? You can't explain. You can't heal this reasonless sadness that seems to have become a permanent part of who you are. Weil didn't offer an easy answer because there is no easy answer, but she offered something that might be more valuable. She offered a completely different way of relating to that sadness, a way that doesn't involve trying to eliminate it, understand it, or justify it, but rather consciously go through it. Give it your complete attention. Allow it to be exactly what it is without trying to transform it into something else. And that sounds absolutely impossible, doesn't it? Because how do you give attention to something that wants to destroy you? How do you look straight into a void that threatens to swallow you? How do you stay present to a pain that has no name, no cause, no apparent purpose other than to make you suffer? But here is what Weil discovered through his own lived experience, through his own diving into the abyss of inexplicable affliction. She discovered that when you finally stop fighting sadness, when you stop trying to explain it or eliminate it, when you simply allow it to be present while you also remain present to it, something extraordinary can happen. Not a cure, not an elimination of the pain, but a fundamental change in your relationship with it. A change that does not lessen the suffering, but transforms its quality, its texture, its meaning, And that transformation begins with a practice that Weil considered the most important of all. A practice she simply called attention to. But before we explore what she meant by that, you need to understand the 3 layers of descent that your unreasonable sadness is inviting you to take. 3 levels of depth. Growing space where you can discover truths that our culture works tirelessly to hide from you. Truths that are painful but also liberating in ways you cannot yet imagine. The first descent that your unreasonable sadness invites you to make is through the illusion of control you've spent your life constructing. The carefully maintained fantasy that if you just make the right choices, develop the right habits, find the right people, your life will be fundamentally good, fundamentally manageable, fundamentally in your command. But when the sadness comes for no reason, it reveals the brutal truth that you've always known but never wanted to admit. You control almost nothing. You don't control how you feel. You don't control when the pain will appear. No. You control whether you will wake up tomorrow with the desire to live or with the desire to disappear. And this loss of control is terrifying, because we were taught that responsible adults are those who manage their emotions efficiently, who do not allow themselves to be overwhelmed by feelings without a logical basis, who maintain emotional stability through willpower and conscious choices. Simone Weil grew up in a family where reason and logic were supreme. Her brother André was a mathematical genius, one of the greatest of his generation, and Simone constantly compared herself to him, feeling inferior, incapable, fundamentally deficient in brilliance. She wrote that, at the age of 14, she seriously contemplated suicide because she believed that she could never make a significant contribution to human knowledge, that her mind was not sharp enough, clear enough, powerful enough to deserve space in the world. And even when she eventually became a respected philosopher, a gifted teacher, an original thinker, she never completely lost that sense of fundamental inadequacy, that causeless sadness that haunted her regardless of her external achievements. And what she discovered through this experience is that sadness without motif exposes the central lie of modern culture. The idea that you can and should be in control of your inner life, that if you just had more discipline, more insight, more psychological tools, you could manage your emotional states like you manage your financial budget or your appointment schedule. But the truth is that you are much more porous than you care to admit, much more vulnerable to forces you don't understand and can't control. The weather affects your mood in ways you don't choose. Your brain chemistry fluctuates for reasons that neuroscience doesn't yet fully understand. Memories, they arise uninvited. Thoughts appear without you calling them out. And yes, you can develop practices that influence these experiences. But influence is not control. And when you finally admit that, when you finally let go of the fantasy that you should be in complete command of how you feel, something paradoxical happens. The sadness doesn't go away, but the terror around it lessens a little because you stop adding to the original pain. The secondary pain of feeling like you are failing to control it, Weil developed a concept she called decreation, which is not destruction, but something much more subtle. It is the process of undoing the constructed ego, the false self that believes it is in control, and that suffers terribly every time reality demonstrates that it is not. Decreation does not mean annihilating yourself. It means letting go of the version of you that thinks you should be able to perfectly manage your inner life, the version that blames yourself for being sad for no reason, that is ashamed of not being able to simply choose to be happy, that feels like a failure because you cannot force your brain chemistry to cooperate with your conscious intentions. And when you begin to let go of that version of yourself, when you allow it to dissolve a little, you create space for something truer, more humble, more real, a way of being that can coexist with sadness without being constantly at war with it. And that first descent through the illusion of control into the recognition of your deep vulnerability is scary because it feels like you're giving up. It feels like you're surrendering to something destructive, but Weil knew that it's not surrender in the sense of defeat. It's surrender in the sense of stopping. Fighting reality, of allowing things to be as they are without adding useless resistance that only multiplies suffering. And that brings us to the second descent that your reasonless sadness is inviting you to make. An even deeper, even more disturbing descent, through the illusion that you know who you are, through the fantasy that there is a stable, coherent self that remains consistent over time. But what if this reasonless sadness is showing you that you are not who you think you are? That the person you believe in, built through your stories, your memories, your narratives about yourself, is much more fragile and much less real than you ever imagined. Weil experienced this viscerally when she worked for 10 months in the Renault factories in Paris, 1934 to 1935, she who had a privileged education, philosophical mind, rich intellectual life, deliberately chose to work on an assembly line doing repetitive manual labor for endless hours. And what she discovered horrified her. She discovered that under work pressure, mechanical, physical exhaustion, systematic degradation, her own humanity began to dissolve. She felt less capable of complex thought, less connected to her moral convictions, less certain of her own identity, as if the self she thought she was could be literally eroded by sufficiently brutal external circumstances. And she wrote about this with brutal honesty, admitting that she had discovered that her own sense of human dignity was not as solid as she imagined, that it could be eroded, that she was not as strong as she would like to believe. And this discovery devastated her, but also taught something crucial about the nature of the self. She realized that much of what we call identity is a fragile construct held together by favorable circumstances, and when those circumstances change drastically, when you are put under enough pressure, the self you think you are can begin to crumble, revealing that perhaps it was never as solid as it seemed, and your unreasonable sadness may be doing something similar. It may be temporarily dissolving the identity structures you have so carefully constructed, the stories you tell about who you are, the competent person, the resilient person, the person who can always handle that life throws at her, the person who has her life reasonably under control. And when sadness comes without reason and without warning, when it leaves you unable to function the way you normally function, when it turns you into someone you don't recognize, someone who can't get out of bed, can't respond to messages, can't feign interest in things that normally matter, you wonder who you really are, if the competent person was just a mask that is now cracking. If the real you is this sad, exhausted creature who can't even explain why she is. Suffering, and this questioning of identity is the second descent. It is the terrifying recognition that perhaps you are not a stable, coherent self, but something much more fluid, much more vulnerable, much more dependent on conditions that you do not control. Weil called this the experience of being reduced to nothing, of feeling that everything you thought was true about yourself was an illusion. And she did not try to sugarcoat this experience with false optimism. She did not say that deep down you will discover that you are stronger than you imagined. She said something much more radical and much more honest. She said that perhaps you need to accept that you are not that strong, that your identity is not that solid, that the self you have built can and will dissolve under enough pressure, and that this is not your fault. It is simply the truth about being human. We are all much more fragile than we like to admit, much more vulnerable to forces we do not control, much more dependent on grace and luck than strength and will. And this second descent, through the illusion of having a stable self to the recognition of your deep fragility, can seem nihilistic. It may feel hopeless. It may feel like it's taking away from you the last thing you had to hold on to. But Weil knew that there is a third descent yet to come. A final descent that can only come after you've gone through the first two. After you've let go of both the illusion of control and the illusion of solid self. And that third descent is where the real work begins. But before we dive into it, I'd like to pause for a moment and know where you're watching this video from now. What part of the world you are looking for. These answers about sadness without reason, about the weight of existing without explanation. Leave in the comments your city, your country, because there is something profoundly beautiful and powerful in knowing that right now, all around the planet, there are souls like yours facing this same inexplicable sadness, carrying that same nameless weight. And maybe Simone Weil, wherever she is now, would be comforted in knowing that her words continue to find those who really need to hear them, that her courage to look directly at human affliction still offers company to those who feel alone in their causeless pain. So tell me, where do you watch us from? And now let's explore this third and deepest descent, because this is where Simone Weil discovered something that our entire culture is built to hide, something that may sound like madness, but which may be exactly what you need to hear before you completely isolate yourself from the world. The third descent that your reasonless sadness invites you to make is through the illusion that you should be full, fulfilled, satisfied, complete. But what if the emptiness you feel is not a problem to be solved, but a truth to be accepted? And what if the feeling of incompleteness that haunts you is not a defect, but a fundamental characteristic of human existence? And if unreasonable sadness is not trying to tell you that something is wrong with you, but that you are finally starting to see things as they really are? Simone Weil developed a concept that she considered central to her entire philosophy, the concept of sacred emptiness. She believed that human beings are born with a hole in the soul, an empty space that cries out for filling, and we spend our entire lives trying to fill that emptiness with everything we can find: relationships, achievements, pleasures, distractions, substances, work, entertainment, spirituality, anything that promises to fill the void, disappear. But Weil realized something radical. She realized that the void cannot be filled by anything that comes from within creation. Nothing we can seek, conquer, or build will eliminate that hole in the soul. Because the void is not a bug, it is a feature, it is not a problem, it is a portal. It is the space in us that was specifically made to remain empty until something totally different can enter, something we cannot seek or force, something Weil called grace. And grace is not a traditional religious concept for her. It is not a divine reward for good behavior. It is something much more mysterious and much more real. Is the experience of being filled by something that comes from outside of you, something that you cannot control or summon through effort, something that can only enter the space created by the complete acceptance of emptiness. And that sounds absolutely crazy to the modern mind, because it means that you need to stop trying to fill the void. You need to stop seeking things that promise to complete you. You need to actively accept incompleteness as a permanent state of human existence. And your unreasonable sadness may be forcing you to do just that. It may be emptying you of all the things you used to fill the hole in your soul: relationships that are no longer fulfilling, work that has lost meaning, hobbies that no longer bring you joy, distractions that no longer work, and you're being left with nothing but raw emptiness. And it's terrifying because it feels like you're losing everything. It feels like you're falling into a bottomless abyss. But Weil would say that maybe, just maybe, you're not falling but descending, consciously and courageously, to the place where the truth lives, to the center of the emptiness you've been living in all your life, avoiding. And in the center of that emptiness, you can find not the nothing you feared, but something that cannot be named, cannot be captured in words, cannot be explained to someone who has not experienced it. Weil had 3 mystical experiences in her life that completely transformed her. The first in 1937, when she visited the chapel of St. Benedictine of Solesmes during Holy Week, where despite excruciating headaches that left her almost unable to function, she experienced moments of beauty so intense that physical pain became secondary, and the third and most profound when she was reciting a 17th century English mystical poem. And suddenly Christ came down and took her. Those are her own words, and she wasn't using metaphor. She meant that something literally took her. Something she hadn't sought, hadn't summoned, hadn't prepared. Something that has entered the space created by years of attention to emptiness, by years of refusing to fill the hole in the soul with inadequate substitutes. And you don't have to believe her religious interpretation to understand what she was describing. She was describing what happens when you finally stop fighting the emptiness, when you allow it to be exactly what it is, when you fully inhabit incompleteness without trying to escape it. And in that moment of total acceptance, something can happen. Not always. Not in a predictable way. Not in a way that you can control or repeat under command. But sometimes, just sometimes, the emptiness transforms. The sadness without a reason reveals that it always had a reason. But it was not the kind of reason you were looking for. It was not a psychological cause to be resolved, but an invitation to see something about the nature of existence that can only be seen when you stop. It's all about trying to fill the hole in the soul with things that were never meant to fill it. And these three descents, through the illusion of control, through the illusion of stable self, through the illusion that you should be complete, these descents are what your reasonless sadness is inviting you to do. Not because it wants to destroy you, but because it wants to show you something. Something about who you really are when all comforting illusions are removed. Something about the nature of human existence that our culture works tirelessly to hide. And now, having descended through these three layers, you may be wondering what is left. If you don't control how you feel, if your self is not as solid as you thought, if the void in your soul cannot be filled, what is left? What do you do with all this brutal truth? And this is where Simone Weil offers not an answer, but a practice, not a solution, but a path. And that path begins with something she called simply attention. The pain you carry, this nameless sadness that appeared in your life without invitation and without explanation, came to teach you something that you didn't want to learn, but that is perhaps the most important lesson of your entire existence. It came to teach you that you can exist without understanding why you exist. You can continue living without having an answer to why you are alive. You can carry deep sadness and still not be broken, only deeply, radically human. Simone Weil learned this in the most visceral way possible. She, who had a brilliant mind that always sought explanations, always looked for causes, always tried to understand the why of everything, had to confront the fact that some experiences have no why. Some pains have no identifiable cause. Some suffering simply is, and the rational mind that she valued so much could not help her. All her intellectual abilities, all her philosophical education, all her training in logical thinking, none of this could eliminate or even satisfactorily explain the weight she carried, and it was exactly this failure of rationality to resolve her suffering that led her to something deeper. She realized that she was asking the wrong question. She was asking why she is sad, when the real question was, how can I exist fully even while carrying this sadness? How can I live with truth that hurts instead of escaping into comfortable lies? And this shift in focus from why to how, from explanation to navigation, was revolutionary, because it meant that she no longer had to wait to understand her pain to begin living with it, no longer had to delay authentic existence until the mystery of her sadness was resolved. She could begin now, in this moment, to fully inhabit her life even without fully understanding what she was feeling or why she was feeling and what her sadness meant. For no reason came to teach you is exactly that. You don't need an explanation to continue. You don't need an identifiable cause to validate what you feel. You don't need to solve the mystery of your pain before allowing yourself to fully exist. Sadness can remain. Emptiness can continue. The feeling of heaviness may never completely disappear. And you can still live, you can still love, you can still create, you can still find moments of beauty in the midst of everything. Weil taught that attention is the most precious thing we can offer, more precious than love, because attention is the purest form of love. And attention means being completely present to what is, not trying to change it, not trying to explain it, not trying to transform it into something else, just seeing clearly, just staying present even when presence hurts. And when you give attention to your reasonless sadness instead of fighting it, when you allow it to be present while you also remain present to it, something subtle but profound begins to change. The sadness does not disappear, but the quality of it transforms. It stops being an enemy to be defeated and becomes part of the landscape of your inner life. Something that is present, something that you recognize, something that you have learned to coexist with without being constantly at war. And that coexistence is not passive resignation. It is active acceptance. It is conscious choice to stop adding to secondary suffering. The layer of pain that comes from resisting the original pain, from blaming yourself for feeling what you feel, from being ashamed that you cannot simply get over what you are going through. Will lived this in her own flesh. She never completely got over her headaches. She never completely eliminated the feeling of not belonging that haunted her. But she learned to carry these things with a kind of quiet dignity, to keep teaching even when she could barely concentrate because of the pain, to keep writing even when everything seemed meaningless, to keep loving the world even when the world seemed meaningless, to have no place for it. And that persistence didn't come from optimism. It didn't come from belief that everything would be okay. It came from something much deeper and much more realistic. It came from the acceptance that life contains both beauty and pain, both meaning and absurdity, both light and darkness. And you can't have one without the other. You can't choose just the aspects of existence you like and reject the ones you hate. You accept the whole package, or you spend your life in perpetual flight from half of reality, and your unreasonable sadness is forcing you to do that. Choice is telling you that you can no longer live just on the surface. You can no longer settle for an edited version of human existence that excludes everything that is dark and heavy and inexplicable. You need to dive deep. You need to embrace the entirety of being alive, including the parts that hurt, including the parts that don't make sense, including the parts that you wish you could give back but can't. And when you finally do that, when you finally stop fighting and start accepting, you discover something extraordinary. You discover that you can carry so much more than you thought you could. Possible that the human capacity to endure suffering and still find moments of grace is far greater than any psychological theory can explain. Weil called this strength through weakness, power that comes not from denying vulnerability, but from accepting it completely. And she lived that truth to the end, even when her body was failing, even when tuberculosis was consuming her lungs, even when she knew she was dying at 34. She kept writing, kept thinking, kept trying to articulate truths she had discovered through years of paying attention to her own pain. And these truths were not cheap consolations. They were not promises that everything has a hidden purpose or that suffering always leads to growth. They were honest acknowledgments that sometimes life just hurts. Sometimes you are sad for no reason. Sometimes the weight of existing is almost unbearable, and there is nothing wrong with you for feeling that way. You are just being honest about what it means to be alive in a universe that was not designed to comfort you, that has no obligation to make sense to you, that simply is indifferent to your emotional needs, indifferent to your desire for explanations, indifferent to your hope that if you just do everything right, the sadness will go away and never come back. And perhaps the greatest lesson that your unreasonable sadness has come to teach you is that you don't need life to make complete sense to keep living. You don't need guarantees that everything will be okay. You don't need a satisfactory explanation for every emotion you feel. You can simply be here, present, attentive, carrying what needs to be carried, living one day at a time, a moment of each time, not knowing where you are going or why you are going. Just walking because walking is what there is to do. Just breathing because breathing is what keeps happening, even when you see no reason for it. And in that deep acceptance of life as it is, not as you would like it to be, you can find not happiness, but something deeper, something truer, something more durable. You can find a form of peace that coexists with sadness, a form of meaning that does not depend on external circumstances being favorable, a way of living that is authentic to the core even when it hurts to be so authentic. But this acceptance that Simone Weil discovered is not something that happens once and then stays forever. It is not sudden insight that solves everything permanently. It is daily practice, moment by moment, of choosing to remain present even when presence hurts, of choosing to see clearly even when clarity reveals difficult truths, of choosing to continue existing even when existence seems to have no clear purpose. And you are not going to wake up one day and find that the sadness has magically disappeared because you have finally accepted it. That's not how it works. What Weil discovered is that you can learning to live with what cannot be changed. You can develop the ability to carry weight without being crushed by it. You can cultivate dignity in the midst of suffering that has no explanation or apparent end. And this coexistence requires specific practices, not self-help techniques that promise to make you feel better quickly, but ways of being that Weil developed through years of attention to his own suffering. Practices that do not eliminate pain, but transform your relationship with it. That do not heal the wound, but teach you to live with an open wound, without leaving that it completely defines who you are. The first practice that Weil considered essential was what she called morning mindfulness. Waking up and dedicating the first moments of the day not to planning, not to distraction, not to try to convince yourself that everything is okay, but simply to observe what is present, including the sadness if it is there, including the emptiness if it is there, including the heaviness if it is there. Without judgment, without trying to change, just pure recognition of what is. You wake up, and before you do anything else, before you pick up your phone, before you start the to-do list, before you put on the mask of functionality that you use to navigate the world, you sit in silence for 10 minutes and simply observe. And what you are observing is not to be analyzed or explained. You are not trying to discover where the sadness comes from or why it is present. You are simply recognizing that it is. You are saying internally, without words necessarily, today the sadness is here. Today the emptiness is present. Today the heaviness is palpable. That's all. Just recognition without elaboration. And Weil believed that this simple act of recognizing what is, without trying to change it immediately, is already a form of decreation. It is already letting go of a little of the ego that thinks it should be in control, that believes it can and should managing every aspect of inner experience. When you acknowledge sadness without immediately trying to fix it, you are practicing active acceptance. You are saying yes to reality as it presents itself in this particular moment. And that doesn't mean that you like reality. It doesn't mean that you think everything is fine. It just means that you are willing to see things as they are before deciding what to do with them. The second practice that Weil developed was what she called attention to the beautiful in the midst of the ugly. When the pain is particularly unbearable, when the sadness threatens to swallow you completely, when you feel like you can no longer carry this weight, you deliberately seek out something beautiful and give it your full attention for 5 minutes. It could be the sky, it could be a song, it could be a poem, it could be the way the light comes in through the window, anything that contains genuine beauty, not superficial distraction, but beauty that really moves something in you, and you are not using beauty to escape pain. You are allowing beauty and pain to coexist. You are practicing the truth that reality contains both simultaneously, and Weil believed that beauty has a special quality. It captures us but cannot be possessed. It invites us to pure attention without the possibility of appropriation. When you look at a truly beautiful sunset, you cannot catch it, you cannot keep it, you cannot make it belong to you. You can only be present to it while it lasts. And this experience of beauty that cannot be possessed is training for the form of love that Weil considered truer, impersonal love. Love that sees and appreciates without the need to control or possess. Love that remains present without demand return. And when you practice this kind of attention to beauty while also carrying sadness, you are learning that life can contain both, that you can feel deep pain and still have the ability to move with beauty when it appears. That sadness doesn't make you blind to everything else. It just changes the way you see. And maybe, just maybe, beauty seen through a lens of sadness has a different, more poignant, more precious quality, because you know that it is temporary, that it exists in the midst of greater darkness, that it is a small island of light in an ocean of shadows. But still it shines, still it matters. Still, it touches you in ways that beauty seen on happy days never could. The third practice that Weil developed was to let go of the narrative. Your mind is constantly telling you story about your sadness, working out explanations, creating patterns, making predictions, saying things like, "This will never get better. I will always be like this. There is something fundamentally wrong with me. No one understands what I am going through. I am alone in this. And these narratives are not neutral. They are not just factual observations. They are ego constructions that try to make sense of something that may not make sense in the way you're looking for. And every time you catch yourself creating these stories, the practice is to gently acknowledge this is story, not fact, and let go. You're not denying your feelings. You're not pretending you're not sad. You're just recognizing that the narrative your mind is building around the sadness is different from the sadness itself. And when you can separate raw experience from the story you tell about experience, something interesting happens. The sadness may remain, but it becomes less totalitarian, less absolute, less capable of completely defining your reality, because you realize that while sadness is real, the story about sadness being permanent is just history. The story about you being broken is just history. The story about no one understanding is just history. Just like history, these stories may have elements of truth, but they are not the complete truth. And Weil called this practice decreation in action. Every time you release a narrative, every time you resist the urge to transform raw experience into an elaborate story about what that experience means, you are undoing a little of the ego that needs to make sense of everything, that needs to control through explanation, that needs to transform mystery into something manageable through narrative. The fourth practice is to do without ego, to keep living, to keep working, to keep creating, keep loving, but without demanding that these activities fill the void or eliminate the sadness. You do it because it is what there is to do, not because you hope that doing it will save you, and that is a radically different way of existing, because most of us do daily activities with the implicit expectation that they will make us feel better. They will give us a sense of purpose. They will fill the hole in the soul, but when you do them without ego, you do them without that expectation. You do them simply because the action is available and you choose to do it, not because you believe that it will transform you or save you. And Weil practiced this in an extreme way. She continued teaching even when headaches made concentration almost impossible. She continued writing even when she didn't know if anyone would read it. She continued engaging with the world even when she often felt like she didn't belong there. She did these things not because they made her happy, not because they eliminated her suffering, but because they were what there was to do. And there was a strange freedom in this way of acting. Freedom not to depend on external results to validate her actions. Freedom to do what needs to be done. Done without constantly measuring whether it is working to make you feel better. And when you practice this in your own life, when you continue to do what needs to be done, even when sadness is present, even when you feel no motivation, even when there is no guarantee that it will help, you are practicing a form of dignity that does not depend on feeling good. You are being human, not in spite of the sadness, but through it, carrying it along with you as you continue to navigate life. The fifth practice is to consent to the day when you wake up, before you know what the day will be like. It will be, before knowing whether the sadness will be heavier or lighter. You make a conscious choice to accept what comes. And Weil had a crucial distinction between resignation and consent. Resignation is passive. It is accepting something because you have no choice. It is defeated surrender, but consent is active. It is a deliberate choice to say yes to reality before you even know what reality will bring. It is an act of love, not to what you expect to happen, but to what actually happens. And when you practice morning consent, you are internally preparing yourself to carry whatever you need. Being carried, you are not being blindsided by sadness because you have already said yes to it before it even appears. You have already decided that you will remain present no matter what the day brings, and that doesn't mean you won't suffer. It means you will suffer consciously, with dignity, with the ability to witness your own suffering without being completely consumed by it. The sixth practice that Weil developed was to write a letter to the pain once a week. Sit down with pen and paper and write to the sadness as if it were a person, not to eliminate it, not to negotiate it, but to acknowledge it, to be grateful for what it taught, even if the lessons are painful, to ask for the strength to keep carrying it, to express the weight without needing anyone to respond or resolve it. You begin, dear loneliness, dear sadness, dear emptiness, and then you write whatever needs to come out, without editing, without censorship, without worrying about how it sounds or if it makes sense, just allowing the words to flow as an acknowledgement of what is. And then you can burning the letter or keeping it. It doesn't matter. What matters is the act of recognizing pain through language, of giving form through words to what often remains formless and unnameable. And Weil believed that this type of explicit recognition of pain does not intensify it, but transforms it. When you name something, when you recognize it directly, you are exercising a form of attention that is in itself transformative. The seventh practice is to be present to the other even in pain. When you are with someone, give your full attention to them, not to yours. Sadness. And that doesn't mean pretending that sadness isn't there. It simply means choosing to focus on another person despite the presence of your own pain. And Weil believed that attention to another is one of the most powerful forms of decreation, because it momentarily takes you out of yourself, momentarily frees you from the prison of your own subjective experience. When you really hear someone, when you really see someone, when you give your undivided attention without allowing your mind to wander to your own concerns, you are practicing Weil's purest form of love. And paradoxically, this act of temporarily forgetting your own pain through genuine attention to another can bring more relief than any amount of self-focus. Not because you are running away from yourself, but because you are temporarily transcending the narrow confines of your own consciousness. Recognize three things: a truth that the pain revealed today, a moment of grace, however small, a choice to stay that you made even when part of you wanted to give up. You don't need to write it down elaborately, just acknowledge it internally.